Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to this series of Stanton Lectures for the current academic session. We're particularly pleased to welcome Professor David Bentley Hart for the third in his series on the light of Tabor, Notes Towards a Monist Christology. Professor Hart has been exploring the variety of Christological models in the New Testament and early Christian traditions, noting that the central subject is always one likely to generate controversy. But he's also been moving us, I think, towards recognition of some common soteriological patterns of thought and practice, these emerging amidst this diversity and offering ways of understanding and assessing how best to describe the significance of Jesus for our human condition. Tonight's lecture, as I say, is lecture the third in the series. Professor Hart has come well equipped with his lecture notes and his umbrella. And tonight's lecture will again be followed by a period of questions and discussions. I should say the recording will continue for that. I hope you're comfortable with the arrangement. And without further ado, I invite you to welcome back Professor David Bentley Hart.
Thank you. There are more people here than I expected, given the bank holiday and the rain, so my gratitude. It's amazing to me that that machine not only has an American accent, but has by far the most annoying American accent possible, just to make us feel less. Recording has begun, it's just rather unpleasant. Anyway, thank you, David. Let me begin again as I've been doing with a pericope. The lesson is from the book of Sirach, chapter 43, verse 27. Hola, rumen umi ethikonta, sintei dialogon, to an estinactus. We may say evermore and yet never attain the end. And the final summary of those utterances is, he is the all. As I foretold, I'm going to turn to two theologians who've written on Christology of late, two books that to me have the great virtue of being in utter polar antithesis to one another, and illustrating thereby two extremes that I want to avoid, at least to my mind. Now, I do this with certain trepidation, as I said, because one of them is Rowan Williams, to whom some of us owe a great deal of our theological careers. I mean, I only do Christian theology. It wasn't actually something I intended to do because of his book Resurrection, which I read as an undergraduate. The other one is Jordan Wood, young fellow, young scholar, talented, little bit on the pugnacious side, who recently published a book on Maximus the Confessor that's very impressive and in many ways very wrong, it seems to me. But I, in fact, recommended the book, so obviously I think highly of it. I just disagree with it. So the two scholars, one quite established and venerable, one quite young and promising, both, to my mind, quite ingeniously in error on cardinal points. And happily, I believe that they go astray at precisely the same point, but in opposite directions. And so I'm going to take the differences between them as illustrative of that tension between, well, what I call the tension between the metaphysical and mythical intonations of the Christian story, just for want of a better categorization. The story the tradition tells of God in Christ, that is. And especially as it's been told since the days of the Christological councils. Because I think there's a certain lesson to be learned, at least using them in this rather crude way, I intend to, from the ways in which throughout Christological throughout the history of Christology, the balances have tended to dip now one way, now the other, but never ever reach equilibrium in this tension between the story of Christ as a narrative of one who descends and the metaphysics that after Nicaea became absolutely inevitable for Christian discourse about what it means to say that the identity of the eternal Son and the identity of Jesus of Nazareth are one and the same. Now, in the case, so let me begin. In the case of well, let me begin with the l'éminence la plus grise. Okay. Always look at him when I speak French, Joshua. He's very much a continental man. In the case of Williams, my metaphysical sympathies are very much on his side in general, even if I grow a bit restless about following some, or even restive about following some of the principles we share. I have a more guarded view, for instance, of Austin Power's account of the relationship of the infinite and finite. I certainly concur with him, however, that the earthly career of Jesus cannot be read as, quote, an episode in the life of an eternal subject which changes its metaphysical location. That the Logos, moreover, is not a divine, as a, quote, instance of the sort of thing that the human individuality of Jesus exemplifies, unquote. The Christian theology must say that the esse by which God is the same esse by which Jesus is Jesus, and that the humanity of Jesus does not add to or contribute to the eternal esse of the Son, and that it is the divine hypostasis that affects all divine and human activity in Christ. These are fairly common orthodox affirmations. I approve, moreover, of his insistence on an analogical ontology of the world's relation to God, and above all, of his claim that this relation is non-dual, and that it appears, quote, in the world in more and less transparent modes, with the hypostatic union providing its ultimate and optimal criterion of discernment, unquote. None of which spares me a certain anxiety at other points. Now, of course, for those who've read, speaking specifically of his book, Christ, the Heart of Creation, there Williams largely upholds Calvin's impermeable partition between the distinct divine and human idiomata of Christ, out of what he would consider proper fidelity to the same that metaphysics that I think he and I broadly share, whereas I tend to see this as getting things somewhat backwards. At least his approach seems at times to suggest not only that God has, in Thomas's terms, no real relation to the creature, but also that the creature has no real relation to God. Not that he would put it that way. It affirms that God is not transformed in humanity, but leaves obscure how it is that the creature is truly transformed in God, or rather into God. Repeatedly, Williams speaks as if the relation of infinite to finite is also a demarcation, rather than a complete modal difference between divine beings' absolute simple plenitude and creaturely beings' dynamic participation in that plenitude, or between infinite being and that which by participation infinitely becomes. But surely, as this difference is at once absolute, qualitative, and one of non-repugnance, neither the infinite nor the finite can be estranged from its own proper idiom by operating in the idiom of the other. Or another way of saying this is that this modal difference subsists ultimately in an ontological indistinction. As God has no real I'm hoping we all understand the Thomistic language of no real relation, right? That God is not qualified, modified, it does not endure a pathos as a result of the relation. One can't presume these things anymore, you know, we're in time declining standards. As God has no real relation to the creature, creaturely becoming is always already comprised in God's being, while divine being is always already the infinite act within which every finite act of becoming occurs. Now, this, I grant, does not annul the basic structure of finite being, but therein lies the essential issue for me. Spiritual creatures by nature always already exist, both as finite and infinite. And I've argued for this elsewhere, and I can't rehearse my arguments here, but I'll provide a bibliography at the end if you wish. And again, well, I'll take note of the difference. It is crucial to be a living spirit is to dwell in a condition of finite becoming. Yes, it's crucial to affirm that. But entirely as determined to an infinite end that indwells that process intrinsically as its only possible final cause. It's natural destiny which calls it forth out of that equally infinite depth of unity within which the living soul has its grounding. As any of us really can affirm just, or can verify for ourselves just from a scrupulous phenomenology of what it is to be a subject. This is a metaphysical and theological truth. But again, also, it's a phenomenologically verifiable fact about conscious rational agency. All of reality is available to our cognition, our judgment, our intentionality, always within a horizon of transcendental absolutes that summon the world into being for us in the interval that lies between itself and that indivisible unity of apprehension that lies deepest and most anonymously within each of us. Between that is two realities always already absolved of any merely finite local identity. To be a rational spirit is to desire everything finite within the embrace of a more originally infinite desire. Hence, rational spirit, teleologically specified, is God. And God could not create a spiritual nature not called to deification any more than he could create a square circle. As Nicholas of Cusa puts it, who's the one who explores this with the greatest brilliance, quod nisi Deus esset infinitus non foret finis desidera. Were God not the infinite, could not be for us the end of desire. Gregory of Nyssa's image of the soul's epectasis into God is in a very real sense simply an image of human nature set free for its own natural end. Now again, I can't argue all of this here, as I say, I've argued it elsewhere, but that's the perspective from which I start. And I'm waxing sententious, so my point is this. It's true that, as Williams says in The Name of Pharaoh, that infinity does not fill in some gap within a finite causal chain, but is rather the whole system of finite agency. Even so, in the case of spiritual creatures, the infinite is already a rational relation intrinsic to, already resident within that system, as he calls it. The infinite may not fill in a finite gap, but it does fill in the infinite openness of that system, and inhabits, therefore, the infinite as its sole perfecting cause and intentional content. In spiritual beings, the finite is always already capable of the infinite, even if in the mode of infinite becoming. And it requires no alteration of human nature for human beings to act in a fully divine idiom. By the same token, if the standard Trinitarian model that developed after Nicaea is correct, God does not possess the particularities of the finite merely in a more eminent mode of the infinite. Nicene Trinitarianism tells us that the infinity of the Father's hiddenness is wholly convertible with the infinity of the Son's manifestation of the divine, and with the infinity of the Spirit's light. And so God is always already expression, always already that infinite form or logos that is actively present in every finite form or logos. Whereas, for instance, Williams sees in Luther's admittedly logically unrefined account of Christ's communicatio idiomatum a failure to honor the integrity, that's his word, the integrity of the finite created order, I see this as its singular virtue. The entire narrative of salvation in Christ is one of the radical transformation of creatures, not simply into a more wondrous frame of finitude, but more essentially into a true realization of the divine infinity that spirit craves always in itself. spirit exists only as the constant disruption of any imagined and inherent integrity of finite nature. And the God-man shatters the illusion of such integrity altogether. Or even the Maya, such integrity. So too, whereas Williams agrees with Calvin that the incarnation cannot be a necessity of creation and that Adam could have been perfect in humanity without reference to the incarnate Son, and denies that humanity can realize its nature only through union to the divine nature, as, quote, both the human and the, I should say it in his voice, a rich baritone, I can't hold it all. Both the human and the divine are compromised if this is the case. I would argue the opposite, exactly the opposite, for reasons that I think I made clear in the previous lectures. I think it wrong to suggest that the human is compromised by its need for the divine in order to exist as spirit, or that the divine is compromised by being the necessary end for and by which spirit exists. Nor do I think it's easy to reconcile such claims with the gospel narratives. At least, as Williams presents the story, it sometimes seems to have suffered a certain expurgation or truncation. Here's a long quotation. Again, I regret not having that plummy RP baritone. The divine act is recognizable not because it resembles any divinity of our imagination. It shows itself divine by utterly refusing what we might be tempted to regard as signs of divinity, by enacting itself ultimately in the emptying of power, the humiliation and the immobilization of the cross. And the resurrection is not a triumphant instance and epiphany of divine power. The life and well-being of the creation cannot be found in the disruption of the finite world by some insertion of the infinite into it. Christ, as finite, as creature, guarantees the integrity of the created order. Unquote. And I have to admit, I find all those assertions oddly jarring. The gospel, for one thing, at the simplest level, the gospels clearly abound in episodes that most certainly do resemble the sort of divinity we might, and that late ancient persons definitely did imagine. Virgin birth, the miraculous creation of food and wine, the stilling of the elements by command, a glorious transfiguration, that's especially important. Very much that notion of theophany that pagans and Second Temple, Hellenistic Jews and pagans and Second Temple Jews and early Christians all share was the principal sign of divinity. Confirmation of divine status by a voice from the sky, resurrection, ascent through the heavens, and so on. I also find curious here the use of the word signs, as that is the very word that the fourth gospel employs to make it clear that Christ's acts of power are not mere feats of marvelous, power, or wonder workers were quite common in late antiquity. Rather, the word signs is used precisely to show that these are epiphanies that fitted the reigning imagery of divine agency on earth. When Jesus is arraigned by some of his contemporaries for seeming to arrogate to himself uniquely divine privileges, such as forgiving sins or comporting himself as Lord of the Sabbath, or otherwise, quote, John 10:33, making himself to be a god, his accusers appear to have a point. Also, it seems to me that to resist describing Easter as a divine triumph seems strangely at odds with the language of both the fourth gospel and the Pauline corpus. Even the claim that it is, quote, it is as human passivity freely accepted that Jesus' death becomes divine agency, unquote, true as it is, this is only one half of the scriptural picture. There is, of course, another side in the Gospel of John, especially. Keep seeking my soul. No one takes my soul from me. I lay it down from myself. I have the power. To lay it down, the power to take it up again. According to John, even Christ's passion is not simply a passion for the Logos. but is more originally the sovereign act of a divine agent exercising a fully divine power. Throughout the Gospels, there's a constant interfusion of divine and human idioms, not merely an irregular syncope between them. Right up to the point of their perfect coincidence in the resurrection, which, at least in John chapter 20, Thomas addresses Christ as O Kyrios mu ke o theos mu, again with the definite article. This seems to be quite the opposite of any preservation of dual integrities against mutual compromise or confusion. Rather, what's revealed is that between the divine and the human, there's no opposition or separation to begin with, and so nothing to compromise or confuse. The human is not displaced or dismissed or diminished in acting in a divine idiom, but rather fulfilled, while the divine eternally comprehends the human idiom in itself as a proper mode of its own infinite agency. And yet, once again, refer to a theme, to an issue I raised in the first lecture. I know that the theological tendencies that Williams is resisting, if allowed to become too preponderant, can shift the balance of Christology towards an untenable extreme on the opposite side of the balances. And that's the specter, at least, that I see in Jordan Wood's arguments. There's much that's admirable in Jordan's book, which is called, I don't know what the name of Jordan's book is, I suddenly forgot, The Whole Mystery of Christ. It's from Maximus, the Lord's wills, the whole mystery of Christ be manifest in all things, or something like that. Anyway, there's much that's admirable in Wood's book. I may disagree with a good deal of his reading of Maximus, but as the venerable adage goes, vita brevis, Maximus longus. So my disagreements there don't need to detain us. I definitely agree with Wood that Maximus, in a very real sense, regarded all of creation as an embodiment of the Logos, though I would prefer that he did not conflate the language of embodiment with that of incarnation, which I think in Maximus is a privileged term specifically for Jesus of Nazareth. And certainly that Maximus meant what he said when he spoke of those who are deified in Christ as actually becoming the Lord, and even of becoming uncreated. I don't think he exaggerates any of his readings of Maximus in that direction. What I find problematic in his book, however, is quite substantial. To begin with, there's a voluble insistence that the union of natures in Christ must be understood in a radically, again, his words, symmetrical way, meaning not merely that Christ is both divine and human to the same total degree, which is obviously essential to any coherent Christology, but that the Son's identity is determined by a mutuality and direct proportionality of act between his divinity and his humanity. Wood even characterizes what Maximus dangerously called the perichoresis of Christ's two natures as a reciprocal interpenetration, going in both directions equally, as he puts it. Then, too, it's Wood's apparent conviction that those natures are not only infinitely incommensurable, quote unquote, but intrinsically irreconcilable, since God and creation share nothing essential or natural whatsoever. And that, admittedly, is not an entirely unreasonable reading at first glance of Maximus's claim that the natures hypostasized in Christ have no common thing, no kinon or koinon, if you want to be Erasmian about it, with one another, other than the one hypostasis by which they're joined in single activity. For Wood, this means that even though deification in Christ is an innate destiny for creatures implanted in them from the very first, it is an utterly non-natural destiny. Again, that's his term, non-natural. So he concludes, Christologic requires, that's one of his favorite terms, Christologic, requires that the principle of hypostasis be understood as what he somewhat nebulously calls an individual positivity. That is a purely dynamic reality that's totally ontologically indifferent to every kind of species, every kind of nature, and therefore indifferent to the absolute difference between divine and human nature. Quote, its positivity and indifference are the exact properties that permit it to exist as the singular concrete fact of the incommensurable natures, that is, to be their identity, unquote. The essential discovery of Neo-Chalcedonian theology claims is just this, that the subject is the most fundamental positive metaphysical fact. I'm sorry to keep pausing there, but there are certain words that are very much part of the patois that he uses. Subject, positive, and positivity are especially central. So yes, this is the most fundamental positive metaphysical fact. Well, if so, then it's also theology's most fundamental metaphysical contradiction. I have to say, Wood's project seems to me to involve a curious mélange of diverse theological impulses. There's a pronounced preference for dialectic over analogy, but in both the Hegelian and the Barthian senses, which is curious bedfellows. There's also something of a Barthian fear of any intrinsic structural fittingness of created nature to the event of Christ. There's also a formidable element of 20th century theological personalism, a touch of Lutheran theogonic divine passibilism, unexpected soupçon of two-tier Thomism in the understanding of the relation of nature and supernature, and a very pronounced anxiety over what he rather abstractly denounces as metaphysical abstraction. This last in particular generates a great deal of rhetorical energy on Wood's part, but perhaps some vacuity as well. Talk of creation in terms of participation, he asserts. I'll get over the jet lag by the time I get back to the States. Talk of creation in terms of participation entails a positivity essentially independent of God's creation from nothingness of realities that differ infinitely from God. And every attempt to conceive of God in the world by the abstract logic of natural or essential relations can only reduce both God and the world to finite and mutually determined realities. I think this is all a terrific inversion of logic. It is Wood here, it seems to me, obviously precisely for want of a coherent understanding of analogy or participation, who's reducing God to a finite thing that exists over against creation, differing from it not in a qualitatively infinite matter, but as objectively alternative to it. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is cogent only as, without any remainder, of participatory metaphysics. It is, I'm sorry to keep using this term, but it is important. It is a purely modal definition of creation as the total donation out of the infinite plenitude of divine being of both essence and existence to creatures who are absolutely dependent on that infinite gift. Only if there were some context of being comprehensive of both God and creation as discrete entities into which the divine will merely posited something utterly unlike itself would it be possible to deny the essential participation of creation in God by nature. But then this would make both creation and God reducible together to some higher principle of non-repugnance in which they would both together have to participate in order to exist in relation to one another, and then obviously God would not be God. The confusions deepen when Wood applies this metaphysical aversion to Christology. Quote, the relation between Christ's person and either of his natures surpasses participatory and analogical logic. Unquote. There's a sense, admittedly, in which this is trivially true. No particular event of any kind is predicted or determined by an ontological description, and so in that sense, every event always surpasses any metaphysical determinations. But no event, even a unique event, even the most original event of all, even the one event that founds all other events, can fail to exhibit and even exemplify the ontology and logic of the reality in which, or at the foundation of which, it occurs. Again, a metaphysics is simply a rule of coherent predication, not a causal force. And it is not a demotion to causal subordination to say of any real event that it must be susceptible of such predication. Whatever we say about Christ is credible only if our claims are congruent with the real structure of being, even if Christ himself should be the singular fact that creates that structure. Nothing we say about Christ is concretely true, in particular if it cannot also logically be true in general. For some reason, I find that ruffles the feathers principally of Lutherans. I like Lutherans, but they're touchy on this topic. This isn't even a relationship of priority and posteriority. Whatever is actual is by definition possible, and so that actuality and that description are, so to speak, simultaneously. To oppose the event of the incarnation to analogical or participatory metaphysics is simply a category confusion. It creates a meaningless rivalry between the Christian story and a basic logical grammar that no proof story can fail to confirm. But I understand what's going on here. What motivates Wood's claims is obviously one of the deep anxieties of a great deal of modern systematic theology. And I find it a strange notion, but the persons that I respect greatly have been prey to that same worry. The notion that even to accord the Christian story an ontological coherence that can be predicated of other stories somehow compromises the uniqueness of the incarnation. We must, it seems, assert not only that the event comes first, whatever that means, but that it does so in an altogether catastrophic sense. Not only impossible to anticipate, but impossible to correlate with the structure of being, as it might be known outside the ambit of immediate revelation, which is sort of the rather crudely reductive way I spoke of the first edition of Barth's Rebel Brief. Crudely reductive and yet totally accurate, curiously enough. And thus we arrive at what I take to be the nonsensical notion of hypostasis as something ontologically indifferent to nature, and yet able through sheer positivity, which I submit is an empty word, through sheer positivity to reconcile the irreconcilable. I think at this point we're employing words evacuated of meaning. If two natures are naturally irreconcilable, then no principle, be it ever so indifferent or positive or dynamic, can ever reconcile. Not even God could effect such an end any more than God could create a square circle. Conversely, if two natures can be reconciled by any principle, be it ever so indifferent or positive or dynamic, then they are not naturally irreconcilable. There is, it is true, an infinite incommensurability between the divine and human natures in Christ, but it is no different from that between the infinite and the finite, or between the absolute and the contingent, or between the participated and the participating. Hence, it is also at a far more radical depth a connaturality, taking us back to the first lecture there. That single race or kind or genus shared between the divine and the human, according to the book of Acts, that one primordial genos to theou, race of God Most High, to theou. God is the actuality of every nature, the one nature of all natures, of which human nature exists, again, entirely and solely as a mode, which is to say, as a mode of in the mode of becoming divine. And surely that's precisely what the doctrine of the incarnation proclaims, at least as metaphysically specified, that the infinite plenitude and universal structure of all being has condescended to be also a finite and particular instance of the real. Now, as for the insistence on Christological symmetry, I don't think it's a sound reading of Maximus. I don't think it's even possible for a 7th century thinker to have thought that way. I believe that the anachronism is basically infinite. But I don't think it's a logically coherent position either when you take it to pieces, which I'd like to do. As of the former, it's true that Maximus employs the language of perichoresis with regard to the union of natures in Christ, which is a somewhat bold decision on his part. But this certainly does not imply mutual permeation in, quote, both directions. Perichoresis is precisely not reciprocity, but rather an original natural containment of two or more terms in one another without confusion. At least this is so in the case of Trinitarian metaphysics, and where Christology is concerned, I'm pretty sure that Maximus never entertained any more incoherent understanding of the word. God is not a finite being, and the divine nature is not a permeable reality. The incarnation is not something that happens to God, but is instead the reality of a man who is nothing but God happening in our midst as one of us. And then too, the only meaning the word nature can possibly possess is all that a thing essentially is or can be. if one's going to use it in the abstract way that, for instance, the book of Acts of Paul doesn't use it. When Maximus says that the natures hypostasized in Christ share nothing in common, kinon, I suppose I take him to mean something that I think is more consistent with the whole of his thought. He's denying not any natural participation of the human and the divine, but only the presence of any kind of univocum common to them both, some distinct property univocally possessed by God and humankind in the same mode. For manifestly, the infinite and simple God possesses nothing under the form of discrete properties or accidents or qualifications, whereas creatures possess their natures always in finite, composite, and diverse fashion, divided between substance and accidents, or potency and acts, and so forth, however you want to, whichever metaphysical system you want to use. If, however, Maximus were really saying that the being and nature of the creature are in any sense extrinsic to the being and nature of God, bound to God by no natural analogy, and that these otherwise unrelated or irreconcilable realities are reconciled to one another in Christ only by virtue of this hypostatic indifference of which Wood speaks, he would be saying something absurd, something even a little atrocious. For one thing, it would be foolish to imagine that God and creation could really be posed over against one another within some more capacious context of existence. Sorry. Obviously, finite beings can possess no real natural properties or perfections that are anything other than participations in the being of God. The absence of any univocal commonality between the natures can't be the absence of an analogous commonality in their most original principle. Why am I dwelling at such length on Jordan's book? Apparently it annoyed me more than I realized, but that's not the reason. It's because it actually touches on the Christological point and chiefly concerned, well, to make in the last two lectures, but in part here. When Wood asserts that hypostatic positivity and indifference are the properties that permit a union of incommensurable natures, he's saying something that I believe cannot be made to be logically continuous, coherent. Neither such positivity nor such indifference could conceivably be a property of any kind. At least I take it that a positivity is whatever else it may be in actuality, and that actuality is by definition also a potentiality, and the only potentiality that it can make actual is already natural to it. Any personal hypostatic realization of a nature is the realization of a nature that's always already intrinsically personally hypostatic, which is to say capable of actuality only in and as personhood, whatever that may be. And this capacity, which is clearly proper to both the human and the divine natures, if the Chalcedonian definition or any of the others on offer at the time is correct, is already an essential natural identity that finds its perfect expression in the one indivisible personhood of Christ. Otherwise, nothing would have happened in the incarnation. Only the same intrinsic orientation toward personhood in the divine and human natures at once makes it meaningful to speak of them as fully actual in and as the same person, in such perfect unity that those natures are not merely contiguous, but truly coherent one in the other. So to deny that deification can be a, quote, supernatural mode of a creature's natural activity, unquote, or in fact, natural at all, quote, unquote. As Wood does, I mean, he says that this would limit deification to the proportions of a natural capacity, is to fail to note an inevitable axiom of all finite change, whether of agency or of patiency. Of course, a creature's deification occurs only in proportion to the creature's natural capacity. Any transformation of a finite reality truly in excess of its natural potential cannot be anything other than its annihilation. While any transformation of a finite reality that is not annihilation is by definition natural to it, and so not in excess of its potentials. An argument also made at considerable length elsewhere. The conclusion then that Wood should draw is not that deification exceeds humanity's creaturely capacity, but rather that humanity's creaturely capacity is naturally infinite. Again, a thing's nature is not a particular attribute or quiddity among other items in that thing's definition. It's simply what that thing is, actually or potentially. If a finite being exceeds what it is at present without ceasing to be itself, even if it can do so only with the help of some extrinsic agency, to go back to the last lecture, then the principle of that very exceedingness is innate to it. You can exceed your own native powers, but not your own nature. Spirit is that which by nature always already exceeds the merely creaturely. And so its deification is a fulfillment of its nature and absolutely nothing other than such a fulfillment. If human nature can be actualized by a divine hypostasis, then divine hypostatization is a natural human potential, even if it can be conduced to its natural end only by grace. If to think what it would mean really to say that hypostatic identity is the only real identity that differing natures can attain. That's the final claim Jordan makes. And he argues it with great force at times, but I still see it as an inversion of logic. Hypostatic identity is possible only because of an always prior ground of identity in the natures. I'm certain that must be true, and I'll argue it more tomorrow. Hypostatic identity is possible only because of an always prior ground of identity in the natures. I love quoting myself. I didn't mean to read that line twice. What could it possibly mean, after all, to speak of the hypostatic as a real dimension of agency and abstraction from the natural? What is this principle that's neither properly natural nor really even supernatural, but quite literally preternatural, existing somehow in addition to all orders of human and divine actuality? How could we then say that the nature ever properly subsists at all in the person, or that the person has the power to make the nature subsist? What could it possibly mean to say that the hypostasis of the Son is both indifferent to the divine nature and also capable of something somehow more than the divine? Who then is the Son, and what then is the divine nature? Is God then a being among beings, whose nature can be exceeded? And how can this notion of hypostasis be reconciled with the use of the term hypostasis in Nicene theology? See, where you shift into the Greek, it becomes the actual legitimate term, where its whole purpose is to signify the real subsistence of a nature as wholly actual, distinguished only according to a certain mode of subsistence, a certain tropos hyparxis. And in what way can the hypostatic actualize a nature unless the hypostatic is in itself nothing other than the actualization of that nature? If personhood is not understood as essentially the instantiation and subsistence of the nature it makes actual, and so as rooted in that nature as its own innermost potential, then it becomes an oddly nihilistic concept, a kind of ontological portmanteau within which potentially any collection of disparate natures and abstract properties might somehow be contained together in a preternatural accommodation that never truly united. And this would conceptually sever those natures from their own intrinsic expression, thereby evacuating the very category of nature of any real meaning, and deprive personhood of the power of truly expressing any nature at all. At that point, the words prosopon and persona would seem to revert to their most superficial meaning, a mask, either dramatic or funerary, indicating only a kind of sterile hypseity, a unity superimposed only as an outer aspect upon what in itself is just a confluence of divergent forces, as much a rupture as a union. It's almost a sort of deluso-Guattarian sort of union, the ever-repeated univocity of person, the unrepeatable equivocity of persons. Rather than claim that the personal union of human and divine, either in Christ or in creatures, demonstrates a priority of hypostasis over nature, it would be better to say that the natural oneness of the human and divine in Christ follows from the principle that hypostasis is entirely the subsistence of the nature it expresses and is exhaustively dependent on that nature. This alone as I'll argue in nights to come, renders the Chalcedonian formulation coherent. And so one still must ask what it is about the divine and human natures, what primordial commonality or identity exists between them at a level more fundamental than any merely univocal properties could occupy, that allows for them to become full, perfect, united expression in one and the same person. The properly essential question of Christology, then, and the only one that can yield an answer that's more than a rhetorical gesture towards some more than miraculous quantum ignotum or persona ex machina, is not how are two incompatible natures reconciled in a single hypostasis. That's rather like asking how 2 + 2 and 7 might be reconciled in a single sufficiently dynamic or positive equation, indifferent to the difference between them. Rather, the real question is, how is it that a full subsistence of the divine nature and a full subsistence of the human nature can be one and the same subsistence without contradiction? And only one answer is possible, it seems to me, or interesting. I'm going to start winding down now. And I've been terrifically unfair to both these books, no doubt, especially to Jordan's, apparently. I didn't realize there was such a disproportion. Acid. What I find most fascinating about their juxtaposition, however, is that both authors arrive at what I can think of only as a two-tier picture of creation, rather like that of the manualist tradition. Both allow for something like a sphere of pure nature, even if for both of them, as for the manualist Thomaists before them, it remains always only a logical possibility rather than a real created order. Williams grants the possibility of a human nature that's conceivable entirely in itself, not requiring to be deified to achieve its natural end. Wood insists on a logically prior irreconcilability of the divine and the human that has always already been overcome by an innate but still non-natural union. In either case, I'd contend the logic of the Christian narrative must collapse under an insupportable weight of modal contradiction. And yet these are not two careless thinkers. It seems to me that what causes their views simultaneously to gravitate toward opposed extremes and yet nevertheless to converge on the same aporia is that same familiar tension written into the very terms of Christological orthodoxy as it has most often been interpreted in theological tradition. Each author is, I submit, attempting to repair an irreparably disjunctive logic, chiefly because both uphold a reading of the conceptual grammar of the ancient Christological controversies, been in this country only a few days and I'm going native, controversies that cannot help but generate false dilemmas. You're still not going to eat Heinz beans at breakfast. So, actually one sees the same tension even in Maximus. There's a troubling vagueness, for instance, in his choice of the word paraphoresis to describe the relation of divine and human in Christ, because as used in Trinitarian theology, after all, the term indicates a total coherence of the divine hypostases in one another, only by virtue of all three wholly possessing the simple fullness of the one divine essence, while differing from one another only in their proper modes of subsistence. Propi hyparxis. By extension, then, the term would appear to be intelligible as applied to Christ's two natures only as indicating the distinction within a prior natural identity. So indeed, as Chalcedon asserts, the two natures in Christ are at once unseparated and unconfused, but this is chiefly because no separation or confusion is possible, as there is no rivalry or repugnance or essential differentiation that must be overcome. There's only the absolute unity of the primordial ground of its perfect expression in the unique moment of indistinction between the infinite and finite. So let me close then, just with a few observations that lead into the next lecture, which is about Bulgakov. Yeah. When I speak French or when I speak Bulgakov. In what's going to come, I'm going to be especially keen to resist various personalist theologies that arose in the last century, in which it became more or less axiomatic that for Christian thought, uniquely person is a concept transcendent of and logically prior to any concept of nature or physis. With this obviously followed from the necessary claim that the two natures can be united in a single hypostasis, as well as from the assumption that hypostasis and person, in the sense we tend to give the latter word today, are somehow directly convertible with one another. For most of theological history, however, the very language of persons has been something of a protean presence and has never assumed the stable form of conceptual clarity or moral centrality we sometimes like to imagine it has. If we reconstruct its doctrinal history, what we find isn't so much a lucid and specific idea naturally developing out of earlier epochs of Christian discourse, but something more like the tale of an uninvited dinner guest who, through a tenuous connection with one of his host's distant relations, insinuated himself into the household and then by sheer tenacity somehow established himself as heir to the family fortune. The Latin word persona entered the Christian lexicon as little more than a cipher, called upon to discharge the roles of two distinct Greek terms of art, prosopon and hypostasis. In the former cases, a more or less literal rendering, in the latter, for want of any better way in the Latin of the 4th century for representing the distinction between the two terms hypostasis and ousia, which were themselves already hazily ambiguous ciphers whose principal usefulness lay in their syntactic rather than semantic distinction. What these words established within the dogmatic grammar of Christianity was that in God there is an essential whatness, ousia, of which the Father and the Son, and in time the Spirit, could then be regarded as a subsistence, and hypostasis, specified solely by a proper paternal, filial, or pneumatic propos hyparxis, mode of subsisting. Most of the Trinitarian terms proper to the Nicene settlement were not names for clear and precise concepts. They were not meant to be. They were semantic tokens distinguished from one another in order to exclude alternative arrangements. And in being translated from Greek into Latin, the range of meaning in those terms was, even then, slightly impoverished. The clearest content of the word hypostasis, subsistentia, in a more literal transposition of the Latin, was progressively diminished. And the same is true of the term prosopon or persona, which gradually ceased to carry the clear connotation of an aspect or appearance of a nature or essence. And down the centuries, in consequence, the language of person, or its equivalent in other tongues, has come successively to acquire, even within theological usage, all the attributes and connotations with which we've invested it in any given epoch, ethical, legal, psychological, social, or what have you. And all the while, we've been constantly, retroactively, and largely unconsciously altering our understanding of its usage in the tradition as a whole. You know, as I always want to say that the concept of person in any period of Christian thought is like a quantum potentiality wave in the standard Copenhagen interpretation, at least, that in being observed collapses into one particular history, thereby, in a sense, creating its own past. But I'm going to leave off there and return to that tomorrow night, right? It's tomorrow morning. So thank you. So.
As Professor Hart indicates, the lectures continue tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. So please do return for the 4th in the series. But we're very grateful to him for his exposition of tonight's lecture, and we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. So feel free to raise your hand and speak if you're so moved. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hart. My question was, how dispensable is Christology then? Because it seems that the solution that we're tending towards is essentially the first part I'm talking about Volkanka, but rather early, it seems, but I'm not here tomorrow, so I might just say it now. So if we dispense with the idea that there is some kind of commensurability, something you have to put together, what is the third thing, so on. There's a lot of dispenses with the whole thing. He says, divine humanity, leave the Christology there. And then you have the kind of antinomic, transcendental enfolding of the absolute within itself, which is just Trinity through Sophia. So it seems that you can do all this stuff of establishing plus what's going on in grace and nature in actually sidestepping Christology. And that's what it seems to me. How much do you think that can be the case?
I'm sorry, I lost the last part of that sentence. I heard grace in nature, but I didn't hear the words around. I'm sorry.
I know, I said it seems that you can do all the correct formulations and maneuvers with grace in nature, using Trinitarian, psychological, transcendentals. You know, the whole antinomic structure in Vulgata is simply this: God is breaking through creation as creation.
Yeah, but that's actually that's not exactly what that's not exactly Vulgata. But the point for him is that Christology is what reveals the structure of being to begin with, but it also achieves, creates, and perfects that structure. There is no, as we were you here the previous lecture? There's a difference between saying that human nature possesses the potential intrinsically, naturally, to be divine, to that which is possible. Doesn't mean that human beings or creation itself, which is entirely dependent on God in every sense, possesses the dynamis, the facultas in scholastic Latin for realizing. I mean, only that one who is in his logos as a man, as a human being, also entirely coincident with, in total indistinction from, the eternal utterance of God the Father, without any interval of difference, can possibly be the ground of the union of all natures in God. He doesn't place Christology. I mean, it's true that the Divine Sophia is well, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow night, so actually I'm not going to say anything.
Perhaps in respect, and perhaps what I meant was that we aren't yet living in the way that Jesus lived.
Yeah, no. We're not, yes.
You have then levels of nature.
Yeah, no.
You have then levels of the way that we live, the way that Christ uncovered the way that we must live in that perfect union of grace and nature. But in a sense, what you're doing then is establishing levels within nature such that we are not really real.
But that's true, and of course that's actually one of the things that Jordan gets right in his reading of Maximus, is that in a sense, for Maximus, creation has not yet actually happened. And I think that's a fair reading of Maximus's Logos theology. And yes, I mean, as said, well, again, you weren't here the other night, but the creature exists only as becoming infinite, called from non-being into infinite ascent into the divine, right? That is nothing other than becoming what Christ is from eternity, right? For Bulgakov and for the whole tradition. What's essential, though, is what not to say is that the creature has any, or creaturely nature has any sort of ontological specification of any kind outside that relationship. It's a very strange notion that I mean, what would it mean for God to posit over against God that which is infinitely irreconcilable with God, or that which is it becomes a kind of nonsense language in which you're simply seeking to affirm divine transcendence with a sufficient tone of holy awe in your voice through constant hyperbole, and it says nothing.
Thank you.
Jake.
Thank you once again. I think I'm following what you're saying about the compatibility of the divine and human natures being combined in the one subsistence of Christ.
Not combined.
Sorry,
Not
combined is
combined.
the one. I think I understand what you're saying there. My question is on the divinization side. And I'm wondering about whether the potential to become divine, or the potentia, as you said, is if you see that there's also a telos to become divine, and that there's not much distinction. Is there a distinction between those two for you?
Well, if you were using the Aristotelian language, which is good, I actually think that properly understood, the Aristotelian system is one of rational relations that's modally impeccable. It's, you know, there's not like the potential exists other than as that which is has its beginning of motion towards the telos that defines it. These are not extrinsic forces in relation to one another. Of course, that was the misreading of Aristotle in the 17th century that became the notion that we're talking about someone causes extrinsic to one another, pushing and pulling. And that's not. The intrinsic relation between origin and end, as between form and potency, is complete integrity. It's an identity, but it's an identity specified by the rational relations. Catherine.
Oh, thank you. David, I've got lots to ask you about, and I won't do it now. But because Sally's here, I wanted to ask about
My favorite of her novels.
lesser assisting mediations. You've been talking about this radical taking up of the human person, the human being into God, this theotic movement. And I want to know about this optimum enchantment that accompanies that you mentioned in your first lecture. The assisting mediations of angels and fairies and beings.
Well, I mean,
Tell us how this fits together, how this panoply of other beings are part of that vision.
Yeah, when I was trying to reconstruct the cosmology and intellectual world of the late antiquity, I mean, it is true that we have turned our way of understanding, say, the language of Paul, but the entire doctrinal inheritance is one of dialectical oppositions, right? I mean, it really is. Eternity is timelessness, over against time. It's one or the other. Without the Ionian interval, without the Ivan, the angelic Ivan, which is there even in Thomas Aquinas, and really, that begins to fall apart. Really, in the 16th century, it's clearly there in late scholasticism and the Renaissance thinkers. And that same cosmological division, I think, is simply symptomatic of this whole notion that it's an either or that is reconciled by an inherently paradoxical event, which is in one sense the rupture of the logic of creation, or not or its preservation as an integrity over against God, depending on which of these two extremes are. I think the more generous view, yeah, I mean, just as the angels push the planets and all that, and prayers to angels and saints and the influences of angels and saints were all part of this community of spiritual life in which there's a natural continuum. I mean, as I said, of course, in late antiquity, the distinction between the spatial and the spiritual has not become what it is for us. So the thinking was at once both of a spiritual continuum and of literally a cosmic spatial continuum, which, by the way, I still believe in. I still hold to the ancient cosmology. I don't believe in all this infinite space, or if I do. But you're right. I mean, I see it as part of the same. I was trying to cover a picture that, in every sense, has been lost, and yet it was the picture that Paul presumed. There simply is not in Paul a language of two natures. It's certainly not nature, supernature, any more than there is in Oregano. It's just not. And the nature-grace distinction, works, righteousness, right? All of these distinctions that we've imposed on the text, I believe, are not only later constructions, but fundamental distortions. And if you were, so yeah, that was the connection, and I'm all for fairies and angels and the astral intelligences. I like to pray to Alpha Centauri with the occasional earnest special intention. But that's the point I was trying to make. Joshua.
Thank you, David. I won't ask about Bulgarian because we can do that tomorrow. But I just want to say I think I completely agree that obviously one can't say that Christology is dispensable in Bulgarian because Christ doesn't reveal a system that would exist indifferently of him. It is, of course, the completion of the act of creation.
And the origin.
Yes. But I suppose I wanted to ask you really about Rowan Williams, actually, and that passage that you brought out of the book on Christ, the Heart of Creation, yes, where that very interesting set of assertions about no authoritative demonstration of divine power, sort of outside of, really, and I think this is where what Rowan would, I'm not going to try and ventriloquize for him, but I do.
Actually, you probably could, you have a lovely voice.
Thank you, David. But I suppose he would, it is where it is the centrality of the cross for Williams, isn't it? It's just this idea, and I wonder if he would say something like, all of those demonstrations of theophany are relativized or subordinated to and become propageutics to the cross. And I just wonder where that sits in what you're saying.
Well, two things. Plenty of gods die and rise, okay, and die badly, actually, dismembered, you know. If that's the issue, what's different, obviously, sort of, this is the real suffering of a real human being, a real historical individual. Yeah, that's a radical revision of the picture. But a revision is not a contradiction. It's not. In John's gospel, there's a reason why. Now, you know, how one interprets it is important, but there is a theological statement being made there that's very radical. No one takes my soul from me. Deep seeking, you know, my life from me. No one takes my soul from me. I lay it down and I take it up again. I have the power to lay it down. I have the power to take it up again. I mean, the point there is that, yes, on the one side is very much a human passion. Both the human and the divine are present there. On the one hand, the light, I mean, I think we all know that in the Gospel of John, the light of the resurrection is there from the very first. I mean, it pervades everything. The cross is already exaltation, already glorification for John. But that's not, you know, just the ambiguous, paradoxical glorification of here's, you know, the broken body of man. It's firmly stated that this is an act. This is an act of sovereign power, of divine power, that he can lay down, he can choose to die or not to die. And the point that I was making about this statement is not, again, I'm not denying there's a very big difference between the Christian story, and I mean, it does radically alter everything. But it's also the case that many of the tropes of the late antique understanding of divinization or exaltation, Jewish, pagan, both. You know, the Second Temple literature, I mean, this divine angelomorphic ascent and descent, is to use the term, I hate the term angelomorphic, but it's become standard. Is very much a part of the Second Temple literature. It's very much a part of the Hellenistic world in general, and understanding what it is for a divine agent to appear in human form, or for human beings to be transformed into divine beings, daemons, into stars, to become glorified among the splendors, the glories. And that's the only point I was trying to make, is that it's not, it most definitely is. Throughout the New Testament, the two idioms are both present in and one another inextricably. And there isn't, and my problem with Rowan's book is that it's like they're on two sides of a partition. At least that's how it reads. And it's, I mean, I don't have a great sympathy for Calvin's Christology, and that's the direction he goes in. The extra Calvinisticum right there. So.
Roll.
Thank you again. Also a question and comment about Rowan's book. I'm the editor of the critical edition of Farrar's Scholastic Vision that Rowan begins with and builds that whole.
I do quite like Farrar. I just have a very different, I'm not as fond of him as all that.
Well, that's the second half of my question. But the first is, as grateful as I was that Rowan used that text, it feels very bolted on to me in terms of the structure of the book. And he says that he's paying homage to Farrar on the 50th anniversary of his death, and then he does come back to him at the end. But I just wonder how much work does that introduction actually perform? And would the book have been better if he had just spent?
It would have been better with something.
I agree.
Yeah, I think it it constrains him in the direction that he can go. And I don't like Ferrer's reading of Shivara, to be honest. I think Ferrer saw he saw the structure, but not the original rhythm. If you remember in Shivara, there's the original structure, the Urstruktur, and then the all rhythmus. And Ferrer got the former, but not the latter. I'm sorry, I spoke over them.
No, that's great. I mean, my follow-up question was, what were your objections to Ferrer's actual metaphysical framework? And you've answered that in part.
Yeah, no, I think he creates a structural difference between the finite and the infinite that ultimately becomes a partition between two things. Even though that's precisely what he's trying not to do.
Yes, I have two questions. Well, the first is, to what degree do you think is the insight into theosis a question of revelation, and to what degree of intuition and rational insight, so maybe philosophical insight? And secondly, do we know everything about the theosis we can know, or is it an ongoing intuition revelation? Intuition.
I mean, the distinction between revelation and rational reflection is one that I would draw very lightly. In actual practice, these things aren't separable. I don't think that revelation is an enigma that drops from the sky and we point at it the way the early bards spoke, trying to articulate the unutterable. So I think it's always a matter also of rational reflection and speculation, but I also see that as a grace. You know, what we know is imparted to us through the light of natural knowledge, which is always already divine light. You know?
Because this would explain the distinction between, let's say, Plato and Paul. Plato has maybe had more intuitive, gracefully insight.
Yeah, but of course, Plato, you know, it's kind of hard to pin down. It goes through variations, but the later Neoplatonists, the Platonist tradition, especially by the time you get to Proclus, insists also on the divine descent for that reason. That there's also revelation at times when, especially in certain episodes of divine descent are absolutely crucial because it can't simply be theory of something minimally answered. There actually has to be a palpable sacramental, incarnate, I think Catherine would like me to say theurgic, reality as well. But I mean, I think Paul marshals metaphysical argument just as much as he relies on revelation. I mean, definitely. For instance, just in 1 Corinthians 15, talking about the resurrection body, there's a very worked out metaphysics there that obviously has the influences of Stoicism, but also probably of emergent Platonism. So I don't think we know. Yeah, I mean, I no, certainly we don't know all there is to know about theosis until we actually see face to face and know even as we are known. But I don't think it's a progress across time which we work out the details better according to a dialectical method in which we've dispensed with one school because another has come, rather than the experience of theosis is in each life. A disclosure of God through the disclosure of who I am. Gregory of Nyssa, the mirror of the soul is forever brightening, and one sees who God is in the mirror of the soul, which is becoming the uncreated.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, and then I think we'll break. So it's just brief because you've got a couple already.
I just want to clarify. When I said dispense, Joshua was right, of course. That I didn't mean dispense outright. I just mean in the order of demonstration. There is a hurdle that seems to sort of mess too much up. That's all I meant. Of course, it doesn't dispense. Yes. Thank you.
I forgive you.
Yes.
I'm very gracious.
Nature and grace. First, Christ is risen. Secondly, this is very.
It's also nasty.
It's a very unsocratic question because it reveals the paucity of my knowledge of this particular subject. But I was particularly keen on the emphasis on the understanding of the passion as a triumph. And what I wanted to ask specifically was, in terms of, forgive my ignorance because this isn't really part of my Christian tradition, the contrast between the understanding of the descent into Hades and the bestowing of life and the subsequent descent as a triumph, as opposed to, say, the Catholic reading of it as victorious Christ. I was wondering, is there a way to be precise about
I betray my ignorance here. What's that distinction? What's the distinction you're making there?
the distinction between?
I mean, the Holy Saturday is a triumph, is celebrated by the Orthodox as a triumph, and they're flinging laurel leaves at each other and all. Well, the other one, I mean, there's something Hansos von Balthasar's theology of Holy Saturday, but that's a rather aberrant phenomenon in Catholic thought too, believe me. I mean, I agree with Ronner that it was a bit bizarre according to at least the doctrinal tradition. And I was so busy, I actually don't know what your question is.
And the question was, is to what extent can we be, through the precision of language that we employ, be distinct about the understanding of the passion and resurrection as divine triumph, and not to fall necessarily into the trap of using empty hyperbolic language to speak of it as being a case of Christ imagined as sort of Invictus in two sort of militaristic or nationalistic sense?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's the triumph of one who, before his shears was done, like a lamb brought to slaughter. I mean, it is still the triumph of one who utterly recapitulates the human in total devotion to the Father by not using violence to dominate, but instead accepting, but as a sovereign act of freedom. That's the point in John and the power. I don't think it's hard to do. I mean, of course, at this moment, in the history of certain branches of the Orthodox Church, the language of Easter has been used by a certain Satanist named Kirill. I mean, Patriarch of Moscow Satanist at the moment, they seem to be the same thing. But I think one only has to be saying precisely that the cross is the triumph. It is in the Gospel of John, it's already exaltation, but at the same time, when you say that, and this is what this is the problem I again have with certain of the intonations in Ron's book, is it's a triumph. Okay, it is an act of free power. It is not simply brokenness and passivity and dereliction. All right, it is the conquest of those things by one who will go to the Father by any route to find us along the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
It seems an appropriate note on which to end, but before we break, we thank Professor Hart warmly once again for not only his lecture, but for his willingness to engage in conversation with us. And we look forward to tomorrow's lecture, the 4th, and the final in the sequence on Thursday. So Tuesday and Thursday, please do return for Professor Hart's final 2 lectures. Thank you all very much, and let us